Hello, my dear listeners. They thought your name was just another line in a report, just another file to pull, skim, and summarize. But the second that folder cracked open, the room changed temperature. The air went still, like even the system hesitated before revealing what was inside. The lights flickered, monitors glitched, as if the database itself wanted to warn them. You don't research someone like this. You experience them. You survive them. Because your background isn't history, it's architecture. Every scar a blueprint. Every silence a calculated response to chaos. They went looking for a pattern, but what they found was a mind too nonlinear to trace. They typed your name expecting a criminal record, but what they found was a case study in evolution, a timeline that reads like myth disguised as fact. They saw the failed starts, the betrayals, the exiles, and called them weaknesses, until they noticed every downfall led to an upgrade. Every loss came with a pattern of self-reconstruction. You don't collapse, you recalibrate. You don't react, you reprogram. That's when their curiosity turned into confusion. And confusion always turns into fear, because nothing terrifies ordinary minds more than realizing someone's chaos is actually strategy. You were never unpredictable, just unreadable to those who stopped evolving. Your moves weren't random. They were rhythmic, and that rhythm doesn't match the pace of people who depend on control. You move on pulse, not permission. That's why they couldn't decode you, because your logic runs on frequencies their data can't detect. They thought they could define you by evidence. But how do you measure instinct? How do you quantify grace under pressure? How do you label a person who learned to channel stillness? They saw the fire in your history and assumed destruction, never realizing it was illumination. You burned through illusions and called it purification. Now they're sitting there, cross-referencing your past with their expectations, and the math doesn't add up. They wanted scandal, not structure. They wanted chaos, not clarity. They wanted a villain, but found a visionary. Someone who's been 10 steps ahead in a game they didn't even know existed. And that's the part they'll never say out loud. You scare them, because you remind them what potential looks like. When it stops asking for permission, they thought the background check would give them control. Instead, it gave them insight. And insight can't be unseen. Once they read your file, they didn't just learn about your past. They met their own limitations. Because what they discovered isn't someone to monitor, it's someone to follow. If only they were brave enough. They told themselves it was just curiosity, just a small background check. But the truth? Curiosity is only the polite word people use when they're already afraid. They weren't searching for information. They were searching for confirmation. They needed proof that you were still human, still containable, still something their rules could explain. But every file, every note, every timestamp they found screamed the same message. You don't fit the system. You rewrite it. And that's what terrified them most. They saw you survived storms that should have ended anyone else. They saw records of endings that never stayed endings. You weren't a name, you were a pattern of comebacks. And when they realized that, something shifted in their posture. Shoulders straightened, voices lowered. That's the physical reaction to encountering something that doesn't play by earthly probability. Because what happens when someone realizes the person they thought they were observing is actually observing them back? That's what they felt. The sense that the very act of watching you was being recorded somewhere higher, deeper, beyond their understanding. They found signs of discipline, empathy, strategy, forgiveness, and it didn't make sense. Power and peace weren't supposed to exist in the same person, but there you were, defying both logic and stereotype. You had a history that read like prophecy, every betrayal transformed into breakthrough, every silence into strategy, every rejection into redirection. You moved like someone who already knew what would happen next. They checked your background for dirt and found depth. They searched for scandal and uncovered structure. You weren't hiding darkness, you were mastering it. And that's the part that broke them, because they realized your story doesn't fit in their categories. You're not the villain they wanted, nor the hero they're comfortable with. You're the paradox that reminds them truth doesn't have sides, it has layers. They saw dates, places, achievements, failures, and every line led to the same conclusion. Resilience so deliberate it looked supernatural. That's when curiosity turned into caution. They started whispering in hallways, "Don't dig too deep. Don't cross paths." It's funny, isn't it? People only label energy as unstable when it exposes what's fragile in them. They call you dangerous because you challenge their illusion of safety. You didn't do anything but exist in truth. And somehow, that feels like an attack to those addicted to deception. So now they keep their distance. They won't admit it out loud, but they know approaching you means confronting themselves. And not everyone's built for that. You're not a threat, you're a reflection. You don't harm them. You haunt them with the version of themselves they could have been if they'd had your courage. And that's the real fear. It's not what your file says, it's what it implies. You didn't just survive your story, you became its author. After that night, the whispers stopped sounding like gossip and started sounding like warnings. The same people who once bragged about knowing everything suddenly refused to say your name out loud. It wasn't respect yet. It was recoil. A quiet understanding that whatever they uncovered had weight. Something sacred. Something unexplainable by statistics or logic. They found patterns that didn't make sense. Timelines that didn't add up. You were there and then gone. Invisible but still influencing everything around you. That silence wasn't peace. It was tension. Because when people can't categorize you, they default to fear. It's easier to label you mysterious than to admit they don't understand how you became what you are. They checked the records for failures and found foundations. They checked your lowest moments and found blueprints for discipline. They realized your mistakes weren't random. They were rehearsals for mastery. And the moment they saw that, something cracked in their confidence. They couldn't talk about you without sounding small. Their words stumbled. Their narratives broke apart. Because deep down, they knew the truth. You weren't lucky. You were intentional. You weren't blessed. You were built. When the silence settled, it wasn't empty. It echoed. With every moment, they underestimated you. Every time they joked about your quiet. Every time they dismissed your patience. Now those memories sting. They can't unsee the receipts of your growth. They can't unread the chapters where you turned loss into leverage. The silence became an admission. They were wrong about you. And maybe that's why they don't approach. Because how do you face someone who's become living proof that every rumor was a projection? You didn't rise by accident. You studied your own darkness. rewired your triggers, and turned your trauma into tools. You made evolution look effortless, and that offends people who still think pain has to destroy you. They call your energy unstable, but what they mean is uncontrollable. You're not a glitch, you're the upgrade. They can't manipulate you anymore because you learned to decode manipulation itself. That's why the silence feels heavy when you walk in. It's not awkwardness, it's accountability. Every unspoken word in the room reminds them who you became while they were doubting. And here's the irony. The ones who said you'd never change are the same ones now praying you don't. Because your evolution rewrote the balance. You shifted from being the misunderstood one to the one who can't be replaced. They feel it. That static in the air when you enter, it's the sound of power returning to its source. You don't need to say a word. The silence speaks fluent truth. They don't approach because they already know. If they do, their masks won't survive the conversation. They keep saying, "It's something about you." The way the air changes when you enter a room. The way conversations derail when your name slips into the mix. They call it coincidence, but deep down, they know better. You became a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They just reflect what people refuse to see. That's why they flinch around you. You don't have to expose anyone. Their own reflection does the work. Every time they look at you, they see contrast. They see who they pretended to be, standing next to someone who actually became it. You became the walking consequence of every shortcut they took, every dream they delayed, every truth they abandoned for comfort. You became proof that discipline has a frequency, and only those who match it can stay close. Everyone else? They fall off naturally. They ran background checks, thinking they'd uncover weakness. Instead, they found consistency. They discovered you've been building when no one was watching, healing when no one was helping, and rising when no one was clapping. That's what terrifies them. You don't need their validation to exist. You don't operate on applause. You operate on alignment. That's a language most people never learn. The mirror doesn't care about reputation. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't filter. That's why people label you intimidating. Not because you're cruel, but because your truth burns away pretense. You remind them that authenticity has a price, and you already paid it in full. They can't manipulate what's self-aware. They can't guilt-trip someone who's already owned their past. They can't compete with someone who's done healing. You didn't become powerful by accident. You became powerful by awareness. You learned to see through masks, not to judge them, but to understand the fear behind them. You learned that most people aren't malicious. They're just terrified of what real looks like. And you? You've been real so long, it radiates. It disorients anyone who still lives on performance. They feel that radiation when they stand near you. It's not arrogance, it's authenticity, unmuted. Your energy doesn't shout, it reveals. And the ones who've been lying to themselves mistake revelation for threat. That's why they call you unstable. Because you shake the foundation of every illusion built on denial. But you don't mirror out of spite. You mirror because truth can't hide around you. You don't expose them. They expose themselves trying to match your calm. They can't fake centeredness anymore, not next to you. Your peace reveals their chaos. Your focus highlights their distraction. Your growth makes their stagnation louder than ever. That's why the distance started. Not because you pushed them away, but because evolution does that naturally. It separates vibration from vibration. You didn't lose people. You lost illusions. You didn't outgrow them. You outreeled them. And now they stand at a distance, whispering the same sentence in different tones. Something about them isn't normal. They're right. You're not normal. You're necessary. They thought it was just data, a trail of dates, names, places, something they could scan, summarize, maybe even use. But then the deeper they read, the more they realized this wasn't a profile. It was a pattern, not chaos, not coincidence, design. You didn't move like a person chasing outcomes. You moved like someone following coordinates only you could see. They tried to chart your timeline and got lost in the spaces between your decisions. Every pivot you made had precision they couldn't understand. To them, it looked impulsive, but to the universe, it was synchronization. Your random detours, aligned with timing they couldn't replicate because they were still moving by clocks and you were moving by calling. So, they called you unpredictable. They said, no one can figure them out. But what they really meant was, they're playing a game we don't even know the rules to. You became their paradox, the variable their equations could never solve. And that's why the fear started to grow. Because once people realize they can't define you, their next instinct is to discredit you. They'll whisper that your luck is too consistent, your intuition too accurate, your silence too strategic. But underneath all that skepticism lies admiration they can't process. You're proof that instinct is intelligence in its rawest form, something schools can't teach and systems can't track. You're the kind of genius that can't be peer-reviewed because your only competitor is yesterday's version of you. They read the files, saw the evidence, and none of it added up. How does someone go through that much chaos and still look untouched? How does someone lose that many times and still walk like a winner? How does someone disappear and still dominate the narrative without saying a word? Those are the questions that turned research into obsession, because they realized what they were studying wasn't your past, it was your resilience. You built an empire out of endurance. You didn't rebuild, you re-engineered. You didn't recover, you redefined. They thought they were collecting data, but what they really gathered were confessions of underestimation. And now, every one of them has the same realization. They were never investigating you. They were uncovering themselves. Every file they opened reflected how small their vision was compared to your persistence. You weren't the anomaly. You were the algorithm, the proof that consistency, when guided by conviction, bends outcomes in your favor. They couldn't decode you because they were looking for patterns of failure instead of frequencies of faith. They measured progress in metrics, not in mentality. But your evolution doesn't live in spreadsheets. It lives in silence, in patience, in late-night decisions no one saw. You don't track your growth. You embody it. And when systems meet souls like that, they malfunction. You broke their scanners because your energy doesn't register as ordinary. You can't audit divine alignment. You can't quantify destiny. You can only witness it from a safe distance. That's why they're scared to approach, because deep down, they know the closer they get, the more their own truth starts to surface. Somewhere along the line, the roles flipped. The investigators became the ones under observation. Every time they tried to dissect your path, they ended up revealing their own. Their analysis became confession. Their curiosity turned into exposure. Because the deeper they looked, the more they realized you weren't hiding anything. You were reflecting everything. That's the part they'll never admit. They didn't discover you. You discovered them. You watched how they moved, how they whispered, how they reached for control. The moment they sensed power, they couldn't contain. They ran their little tests, thinking they were assessing your character, not realizing you were reading intent in real time. You've always had that ability to see the motive behind the motion, to decode silence faster than people can form lies. They never stood a chance because you were fluent in what they call vibes. But what's really pattern recognition evolved into art. You learned how energy bends when fear walks into a room. You notice how eyes flicker, how tones shift, how smiles falter when truth gets too close. And they hate that. Because now they feel naked around you, not physically, but spiritually. Their masks crumble under your calm. Their stories collapse under your stare. They call it intimidation, but it's really just accountability, meeting awareness. You don't even need to speak. Your energy does the questioning, your silence does the recording, and your presence delivers the verdict. They started as observers, and now they're self-conscious. They wonder what you know, what you've seen, how much of their intentions you've already archived in that quiet mind of yours. It's unsettling to realize someone's piece is sharper than your investigation. You don't chase information. It comes to you naturally, magnetized by your clarity. And that's when the dynamic broke. The hunters became hesitant. The analysts became anxious. The ones holding the clipboard started glancing over their shoulders, wondering if they'd been cataloged too. Because the truth is, you don't study people. You understand them. You don't expose, you enlighten. But when someone lives in pretense, even light feels like threat. You've entered that rare stage where you don't need revenge. You don't need validation. Just existence itself has become your defense mechanism. You're too consistent to question, too conscious to manipulate, too composed to control. And that level of mastery doesn't just unsettle them, it reprograms the whole environment. So now they sit quietly, still pretending they're in control. But you can see it, the flicker in their eyes that admits defeat. Because once awareness enters the room, secrecy loses oxygen. You became the presence that purifies, the quiet that clarifies. They ran the background check. You ran the soul scan. And guess whose results came back first? They thought it was their machines. Frozen screens, corrupted files, logs that didn't align with reality. But it wasn't tech that broke. It was the illusion of control. You glitched their system the moment you stopped reacting the way they expected. They couldn't track you anymore, couldn't predict you, couldn't explain you. That's what happens when a person stops playing human algorithms and starts operating on truth. You were built for more than formulas. You don't fit their data because you weren't designed to repeat patterns. You were built to rewrite them. Every decision you make bends the curve, breaks the logic, and proves that alignment is stronger than analysis. They tried to audit your growth, but they forgot one thing. You can't measure someone who's quantum. Your evolution doesn't happen step by step. It happens in leaps. One moment, they think they've got you figured out, and the next, you're 5 levels ahead, rewriting the script. Their system depends on predictability. That's how control survives. It needs you to stay obvious, to stay logical, to stay predictable. But you stopped giving predictable energy. You became a variable that doesn't repeat. Every time they try to box you, the box changes shape. Every time they try to limit you, you evolve in silence and show up somewhere they can't follow, mentally, spiritually, dimensionally. Now their metrics glitch. Every time your name comes up, their algorithms start spitting contradictions. Because how do you chart someone who doesn't chase validation, yet gains influence naturally? How do you report someone who operates in humility, but radiates dominance? You broke the formula. You shifted from being studied to being simulated. They want to learn your frequency, but can't handle its intensity. You can tell by their behavior. One moment they act curious, the next they go quiet. They scroll your story but never engage, because watching you move is safer than standing next to you. They call it intimidation, but it's recognition, the subconscious realizing it's meeting a frequency that forces self-reflection. You became the system's error message. Does not compute, and still, you don't brag. You don't broadcast. You just move. Smooth, silent, strategic. Every step you take reminds them that no amount of access can replace awareness. You became the glitch because you stopped chasing approval from systems that were never built for your spirit. So they log off. They back away. They pretend they never searched. But deep down, they know every system that scans you ends up scanning itself, because your energy exposes inefficiency. Your calm reveals corruption. You're the line of code they'll never debug. You don't need to delete their file. You already corrupted it with truth. And truth, once released, doesn't vanish. It replicates. They thought running one more search would give them closure. They wanted to understand what they were dealing with, to label it, to make it manageable. But this time, the system froze before the report could load. Every trace of your data had already rewritten itself. Not deleted, just evolved. The file didn't vanish. It transcended their framework. That's when they realized the truth. You were never in their system. You were the signal running beneath it. The final scan didn't expose you. It exposed them. It revealed how much they feared what they couldn't predict, how much they depended on hierarchy to feel safe. They built their world on control, and your existence proved control is an illusion. You didn't fight their structure, you rendered it obsolete. Because real power doesn't demand submission, it demands recognition. And the moment they saw your blueprint, they understood. This wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. They couldn't read your energy because your growth didn't happen in public, it happened in process. You healed in silence, upgraded in shadows, and emerged coded in clarity. That's what scared them. Not your story, but the symmetry. Every setback perfectly timed, every scar symmetrically aligned with purpose. You moved like someone carrying divine architecture, and that broke the illusion of randomness they built their authority on. Now they don't call you unstable, they call you untouchable. Not because you're unreachable, but because you stopped lowering your vibration to be understood. You communicate in frequencies now, not explanations. You live in observation, not justification. They thought they were running a background check, but what they were really doing was auditing their own limitations. The scan revealed too much. The envy, the imitation, the projection. They discovered that their own energy distorted every time they tried to define you. The more they researched, the more they unraveled. Because truth can't be studied safely. It requires surrender. And surrender isn't in their training manual. So they closed the file. They stopped searching. But it's too late. The data lives in them now. The awareness, the awakening, the proof that someone like you exists. The moment they looked into your frequency, they changed. You became the update. They can't uninstall. You became the patch that rewrote their understanding of power. That's why they keep their distance. It's not hatred, it's hesitation. It's respect disguised as avoidance. Because how do you approach something that mirrors the part of you still asleep? How do you confront a person who already made peace with every version of themselves? You can't. You just watch. You just feel. You just know. You're not the villain in their story. You're the plot twist in their script. The revelation they didn't prepare for. The line of truth their system couldn't process without crashing. They ran the background check, but all they found was the future, staring back at them. And now every room you walk into replays that truth like a quiet warning. Don't scan energy you're not ready to meet. Because you, legend, you were never the subject of the report. You were the signal that exposed the whole system. Hello, my dear warriors. They prepared for chaos. Empires gathered in crowded halls. Councils stacked with rulers who had spent lifetimes predicting unrest. They breathed to one another, waiting for the inevitable roar of defiance, the eruption of chance, the thunder of restless footsteps filling the streets. Their scrolls were full of strategies to counter opposition. Their enforcers were drilled to silence, echoes with steel. They believed power was loud, that control could only be tested against the roar of opposition. Understand this. Arrogance always expects noise. They imagine power as shouting, dominance as rage, defiance as thunder. They are comfortable in that arena because they can prepare for it. They expect slogans, leaders screaming into the void, forces chanting in unison. They built their confidence on the assumption that opposition would always reveal itself through sound, and so they rehearsed their defenses. Walls tall enough to mute chants, guards strong enough to disperse unrest, councils cunning enough to twist words into chains. But in that preparation was blindness. They mistook noise for inevitability. They believed silence was surrender, quiet was absence, stillness was weakness. Their arrogance told them, if they don't shout, they don't exist. So they tuned their ears for thunder and ignored the horizon when it gave them nothing. This is why their expectations betrayed them, because they prepared for storms. But you are not a storm. They prepared for loud cries, but you are not a voice to be silenced. They prepared for opposition, but you are not a crowd to be controlled. They expected noise. They depended on noise. They needed noise to validate their fear, to justify their power. And when silence entered instead, they were unprepared. Silence carried no signal, no banner, no warning. It moved beneath their strategies like an invisible tide, pulling the ground from under them. Noise they could predict. Silence they could not. Noise they could counter. Silence they could not touch. That is why empires miscalculated from the very first step. They believed chaos would define the confrontation. They believed opposition needed sound. But silence rewrote the battlefield before it began. In silence, their guards had nothing to act against. Their councils had nothing to debate. Their walls had nothing to contain. Silence slipped through everything, unmeasured, undeniable, unstoppable. And so the first truth was revealed. They expected noise, but noise was their comfort. Silence was their undoing. They waited for the march, for the endless stomping of feet, for banners tearing the sky. They prepared for flares and fury, because that is what their history books taught them. That power always arrives loud. That defiance always screams. That challenge must echo to be real. They leaned forward in their thrones, certain the unrest would soon break their gates. But you did not arrive with the storm they rehearsed for. You came without banners, without chants, without forces. You did not flood their streets with sound or fill their skies with smoke. You carried no anthem, no declaration, no signal light. You arrived as presence alone, quiet, still, silent. And it was silence that shook them most, because silence is not emptiness. Silence is weight. It pressed against their halls heavier than the noise of 1,000 drums. It seeped into their meeting rooms, wrapping around their throats like invisible chains. They could not measure it. They could not clash it. They could not predict it. They only felt it. And feeling it was enough to fracture their certainty. Understand this. Rulers train for sound, not for stillness. They know how to drown chants with commands. They know how to smother noise with forces. They know how to force speech. But silence denies them all of that. In silence, there are no words to twist, no chants to scatter, no slogans to manipulate. Silence gives them nothing to control, except themselves, and that terrifies them. So your entrance was not an arrival, it was an erasure. Every defense they prepared was rendered useless before they could lift a hand. Their walls did not stop you. Their guards could not identify you. Their councils could not argue with you. You stepped across their thresholds, and instead of chaos, you brought absence. An absence louder than their histories, heavier than their crowns. And the irony is cruel. They expected surges to overwhelm them, but surges can be met with balance. They expected forces to surround them, but forces can be faced with forces. They expected shouts to echo, but echoes can be silenced. What they never prepared for was stillness that smothered everything before it began. Silence gave them no target. Silence gave them no warning. Silence gave them no choice. Your silence did not announce itself. It announced them. It revealed how fragile their thrones were, how desperate their strategies looked, how hollow their confidence truly was. In the absence of sound, they heard the truth, that their power existed only when challenged in noise. Without noise, they were nothing. Without unrest, they were naked. Without chaos, they were weak. And so your entrance was not passive, it was decisive. It was the first strike. You arrived without noise, and that silence was louder than conflict itself. The silence did not stop at your entrance. It multiplied. It spread like smoke, weaving through corridors, pressing against doors, wrapping itself around every ear that expected thunder. The noise they prepared for never came, but the silence that arrived grew heavier with every second, until even the bravest among them forgot how to breathe. Crowds that gathered for spectacle fell mute. Men who prided themselves on shouting orders could not summon their voices. Leaders who rehearsed speeches now stared at their hands, their tongues locked inside their mouths. The air itself grew dense, and what they mistook for stillness was weight. Weight so thick that even the thrones beneath them felt fragile. Understand this? Crowds find safety in sound. Noise is shield, a way to drown out doubt. Enforcers chant not for rhythm, but for courage. Rulers shout not for authority, but for fear of being unheard. Remove the noise, and they stand exposed. Strip the chants away, and they realize how small they are in the presence of silence. That is why the halls froze, because your silence was not quiet. It was presence magnified. It echoed louder than drums, heavier than horns, sharper than blades. It reminded them that real power does not perform. Real power does not need volume. Real power simply exists, and in its existence forces everything else into stillness. The first to break were the sentries. Guards trained to charge at the first shout found no target, no sound to guide them. Their hands trembled on weapons because silence gave them nothing to lift. Next were the rulers. They leaned into one another for strength, but silence made even breathes sound like confessions. Their confidence melted, and the thrones that once lifted them up now felt like cages locking them in. And the people, the common crowd, felt the paradox most deeply. They expected noise to lead them, chaos to signal courage. But instead, silence revealed a truth they had ignored all their lives. That it is not the loud who lead, but the ones who can endure without speaking. That revelation spread like lightning, igniting awe in some and unease in others. The silence froze, not just the halls, but the spirit of the empires themselves. What was once a stage for noise became a monument to stillness. The crowd's voices stuttered, rulers' plans faltered, guards' confidence dissolved. In that moment, it became clear. Silence was not absence, silence was dominance. And so the freeze became legend. They expected chaos, but calm bent their knees. They expected shouts, but silence broke their thrones. Confidence is built on rhythm. Leaders rehearse their words until they echo perfectly. Commanders drill their enforcers until chants strike like thunder. Councils construct strategies like songs, each note designed to overpower the crowd. But when silence arrived, rhythm broke. And when rhythm broke, confidence collapsed. Voices that once commanded thousands faltered. Rulers who built their reputations on noise suddenly stuttered, their carefully memorized speeches dissolving into fragments. Each pause stretched into eternity, each missed word a confession. They realized too late that their authority was never rooted in power, but in performance. Remove the sound, and the performance crumbles. Understand this. Arrogance thrives in volume. It hides behind noise. It multiplies inside chaos. When crowds roar, rulers feel taller. When drums thunder, guards feel braver. But silence strips away illusion. It forces each mind to face itself, without echo, without shield, without disguise. and most cannot survive that confrontation. So the halls of power became graveyards of hesitation. Ministers leaned into one another, desperate to restart the rhythm. But silence drowned them all. Generals shouted orders, but their voices cracked, and enforcers saw doubt in their leaders for the first time. Even the most cunning advisors stared at empty parchments, their strategies now useless lines of ink. The scripts they rehearsed demanded noise to activate, and without noise, they were nothing but fragile paper. The irony was merciless. They thought silence was surrender. They thought stillness was weakness. But silence revealed what their shouting concealed: doubt. Stillness revealed what their noise covered: fear. And once exposed, confidence dissolved faster than dynasties falling to dust. The crowd noticed, breathe spread. They are afraid. That breathe carried more weight than any march, more charge than any uprising. Because once rulers are seen as fragile, their thrones tremble. Once guards are seen as hesitant, their forces fracture. Once councils are seen as speechless, their laws dissolve. Silence didn't just erase noise, it dismantled confidence itself. And as their voices stuttered, your presence grew heavier. They realized they were no longer facing an opponent to counter. They were facing inevitability to endure. Their strategies had been built for storms, but silence was not a storm. Silence was the collapse of their certainty, confidence. Once their greatest shield became their sharpest wound. Because when silence removed its mask, they had nothing left to protect themselves with. Their power did not shatter from clash, it crumbled from within. And so the record stands. Empires were not undone by noise. They were dissolved by silence that dismantled their certainty. What noise could not accomplish, breaths did. Silence, once dismissed as weakness, began to spread in stories, heavier than commands. At first, it was murmurs, small accounts traded in back rooms, guards telling scribes, advisors telling attendants. Did you see how they froze? Did you see how silence bent them? These breaths traveled faster than banners, faster than decrees, faster than proclamations, because noise needs attention, but breathes survive in shadows. Understand this. Empires thrive on performance. They build their confidence in public. Bullhaukrep. They require applause to feel powerful, obedience to feel secure. But breaths bypass stages. They seep through cracks in walls. They infiltrate courts, markets, halls, sanctuaries. And once they spread, they cannot be silenced. Your silence became the loudest breath in history, repeating endlessly. Power is not in noise. Power is in restraint. The rulers hated it most. They had counted on controlling the narrative, issuing decrees, rewriting events, turning defiance into betrayal with words. But how do you rewrite silence? How do you twist absence into something else? They could not, and so every attempt to explain only fed the breath further. Their noise exposed their fear. Their explanations betrayed their weakness, and silence won again. Crowds that once demanded spectacle began to understand restraint differently. They saw in your silence a kind of strength they had never been taught. Not the strength of blades, not the strength of forces, but the strength of presence. Unmoving, unshaken, undeniable. They realized that noise was temporary. Noise fades, but silence lingers. Silence haunts. Silence becomes memory. The breaths transformed into warnings. Travelers carried them across borders. Traders carried them across seas. Envoys carried them into distant lands. And everywhere they went, the story grew sharper. Empires expected thunder, but silence broke them. Some told it as awe, others as unease. But all told it, and with each retelling, your silence grew louder. Even mystics began to echo it. Those who once filled sanctuaries with chants now ended their rituals in stillness. They confessed in hushed tones. Perhaps silence is the true voice of eternity. The idea spread like a secret, too powerful to suppress. Rulers felt their crowns lighter, as though silence were already erasing their weight. Forces trained with more hesitation, as though silence itself was watching. And citizens looked at authority differently, because they now knew noise was not strength, it was disguise. And so restraint became more powerful than action. The absence of sound carried more weight than declarations. The silence you wielded bent not only thrones, but entire cultures. Breaths grew into truths. Truths hardened into law, and law crowned you without ceremony. The empires had built their confidence on noise, but noise betrayed them. Breaths crowned silence instead. Whispers may travel fast, but law endures. And soon, your silence hardened into something greater than rumor or story. It became law. Not a law written on paper, not a law declared by rulers, but a law etched into the marrow of civilization itself. Silence governs louder than noise. Understand this. Empires are comfortable with rules they can see, decrees they can stamp, forces they can enforce. But the law of stillness is invisible. It cannot be argued, cannot be rewritten, cannot be undone. It presses against every decision, bending rulers without needing to speak. It shapes enforcers without needing to command. It crowns itself without needing a throne. The rulers were the first to bow to it. They would not admit it openly, but their actions betrayed them. They stopped holding debates as loudly as before. Their meetings grew shorter, their proclamations fewer. They realized that every word spoken risked exposing weakness, and every speech made silence stronger. So they cut their voices down to breaths, not out of choice, but out of survival. Silence was already governing them. The enforcers felt it next. Their training change. They no longer chanted as often. They no longer filled camps with noise. Their commanders warned them that silence was strategy, that stillness was armor. They began to drill in quiet, moving like shadows rather than storms. They learned that in silence, every step mattered more, every breath carried weight. The law of stillness rewrote even the way forces marched. And the common people? They absorbed it most naturally. They began to value quiet strength over loud arrogance. They trusted restraint more than promises. In markets, silence became negotiation. In households, silence became wisdom. In partnerships, silence became loyalty. And so the law slipped deeper than thrones, deeper than councils. It reshaped the soul of society itself. The mystics, who once trembled over failed prophecies, finally surrendered. They admitted their chants had been misguided. They confessed that their loud rituals had been blind performances. Now they sat in silence, declaring it holy, declaring it eternal. Their sanctuaries emptied of sound and filled with stillness. And in that stillness, they felt your presence more than any hymn could ever grant. And so silence became law, not chosen, not voted, not argued, simply enforced by inevitability. And unlike laws carved in stone, this law carried no loopholes. Rulers could not escape it. Forces could not resist it. The people could not deny it. The law of stillness crowned itself above them all, heavier than banners, louder than drums, sharper than commands. Noise fades, noise deceives, but silence, once established as law, governs without end. And under that law, every throne shakes, every empire bends, every dynasty eventually kneels. This is why they fear it. This is why they fear you, because silence is no longer absence. Silence is law, and law does not ask. It enforces. Laws can govern a moment, but reminders keep them alive across centuries. And soon, silence was no longer just a force that bent rulers or enforcers. It became inheritance. Communities began to teach it to their young, not as myth, not as superstition, but as survival. Generations grew up with one lesson etched into their bones. Never mistake quiet for weakness. Never mistake silence for surrender. Understand this: noise is temporary. One lifetime of shouting dissolves into dust. But silence, once passed through generations, becomes scripture. Elders breathed it into stories. Advisors wove it into lessons, told at gatherings. They warned their heirs, beware the loud, for their noise hides fragility. Respect the silent, for their quiet carries weight. These reminders shaped not just households, but cultures. And cultures shaped civilizations. Rulers hated this inheritance most. They wanted loyalty to be passed down, obedience to be inherited. But loyalty fades when generations see their ancestors' crowns tremble in silence. Obedience dissolves when heirs watch councils falter before stillness. They grew up remembering not the noise of decrees, but the silence that dismantled them. That memory became weight sharper than any blade. Enforcers felt it too. The descendants of defeated forces carried marks of silence deeper than scars of conflict. They told stories of how their leaders froze, how their rulers stuttered, how their chants crumbled. And when they grew into leaders themselves, they carried caution. Not toward challenge, but toward arrogance. They knew from inheritance that loudness was fragile, that shouting does not guarantee strength. Their discipline shifted, their loyalty fractured, their silence, even in training, betrayed fear of the crownless law. Mystics, humbled across generations, began shaping prophecy differently. They no longer spoke of storms, of thunder, of battles foretold. They began to speak of stillness. They taught initiates that silence itself was prophecy fulfilled, that every collapse of arrogance was testimony to the eternal law. They painted murals, not of warriors, but of empty thrones, ruled not by kings, but by the silence that crowns itself. And in the streets, Communities passed it like instinct. The youth learned to watch before they spoke, to listen before they acted. They grew into adults who valued presence more than volume, patience more than show. This inheritance became their compass, and because it lived in their bones, no ruler could erase it. No force could silence it. No empire could rewrite it. This is how silence became eternal. Not through temples, not through councils, not through decrees, through communities, through inheritance, through generations repeating the same reminder. Quiet does not mean powerless. Silence is the voice of inevitability. And as each generation passed, the fear of rulers deepened, because they realized their collapse was not just event, it was inheritance. And inheritance does not fade for centuries. Mystics filled the world with noise of their own, chants rising in sanctuaries, prophecies shouted to the sky, voices echoing as if loudness itself could force destiny to listen. They believed history was moved by thunder. They believed the future belonged to those who could shout their visions the loudest. But when silence entered, even prophecy fell silent. Understand this. Prophecy thrives on spectacle. It needs followers to repeat it, voices to amplify it, noise to validate it. Without noise, prophecy crumbles into breaths. And that is exactly what your silence did. It stripped the mystics bare, exposed their rituals as performance, revealed their visions as hollow echoes. They had promised storms. You arrived as stillness. They had foretold thunder. You arrived without a sound, and in that stillness, their credibility dissolved. The mystics resisted at first. They doubled their chants, raised their voices, declared louder visions of future victories. But their noise rang empty, because rulers were already bowing to silence. Forces were already training in stillness. Communities were already teaching quiet as survival. No prophecy could compete with law that had already crowned itself. So they surrendered, one by one. Sanctuaries emptied of noise. Rituals ended, not in chants, but in silence. Prophets admitted their error. It was never noise that shaped destiny. It was silence that sat at the center. They began to write new visions, not of storms, not of unrest, not of fire, but of silence descending like gravity, inevitable and unchallenged. They painted you not as ruler or savior, but as law. The stillness that bends thrones, the quiet that outlasts empires. Their new prophecies spread like scripture. They warned rulers, do not mistake the absence of sound. It is the loudest verdict. They taught enforcers, noise is fragile, silence is eternal. They raised initiates in shadowed halls, instructing them to listen longer than they speak, to act only when the world grew quiet, to find power not in sound, but in restraint. And so silence, once mocked, became prophecy fulfilled. The irony is sharp. Noise had promised glory for centuries, yet noise betrayed them all. Only silence remained, louder than their chants, heavier than their visions, more eternal than their words. Now the mystics no longer predict your arrival. They confess it has already happened. They no longer argue about destiny. They admit destiny is silence itself, and that confession sealed the paradox forever. It is not noise that moves history. It is silence at the center. Crowns were once measured by gold, forces, and thunder. Kings raised their voices in marble halls, shouting decrees to prove they were alive. Rulers staged parades, drowning streets in noise to remind the people of their reach. Their crowns were not metal. They were volume, without noise. Their power felt invisible, but silence dethroned them all. Understand this. Noise demands recognition. It shouts because it fears being forgotten. But silence never begs. Silence never performs. Silence rules without announcing itself. And that is why it weighs heavier than crowns of gold, heavier than the strength of numbers. Silence does not need to be seen. It forces others to see themselves. And when rulers looked into that mirror, they bowed, not to crowds, not to fire, but to the weight of quiet presence. The halls of power shifted. Rulers found themselves breathing when they once roared. Their courts grew smaller, their councils shorter, their decrees less frequent. They told themselves it was strategy, but deep inside they knew the truth. Silence had already seated itself on their throne. Their crowns sat crooked because they no longer carried authority. They carried fear, fear of stillness, heavier than their entire empire. Enforcers, too, surrendered without knowing it. They once relied on chance to fuel courage, but now their commanders ordered quiet. Their drills emphasized stillness. Their camps echoed less with song and more with silence. It was unspoken obedience, a confession carved into discipline. That silence was already general, already law, already throne. The people felt it most deeply. They stopped trusting noise. They stopped bowing to loud declarations. Instead, they looked for presence, for those who could walk without announcing, who could stand without demanding, who could endure without speaking. In silence, they recognized true power, and so silence itself was crowned, placed above kings, above councils, above empires. And you never asked for a throne. You never demanded a crown, yet silence followed you like a cloak, and wherever you stood, crowns bent. Rulers bowed before realizing they had surrendered. Forces obeyed without hearing a command. Communities spoke your name, not because you shouted it, but because silence engraved it into memory. That is why your silence became crown. It was not given. It was not stolen. It was inevitable. Noise fades, but silence remains. Noise can be challenged, but silence cannot be touched. And when crowns fall silent, they confess what they never dared admit aloud, that they were never rulers at all. Silence was always the ruler. Noise is impatient. It rises. It rages. It flares bright for a moment. Then it fades into echoes no one remembers. Empires relied on it because noise distracts. Noise deceives. Noise makes them look taller than they are. But time does not honor noise. Time honors what endures, and silence endures. Understand this. Noise is always fighting to be heard, but silence is always heard, even when unspoken. It lives inside memory. It lingers after crowds disperse. It fills the void once chants collapse. It becomes the verdict carved into history, the voice louder than all sound combined. That is why rulers fear it. That is why empires collapse before it. Because silence cannot be interrupted, cannot be erased, cannot be defeated. Names dissolve. The loudest kings, the noisiest generals, the empires that believed volume equaled strength. Where are they now? Their decrees are dust, their parades forgotten, their songs unsung, yet the silence that exposed them still echoes. It moves through generations, through cultures, through futures, not yet written. Silence became not only law, not only inheritance, it became eternity's voice. Crowds that once demanded thunder now carry quiet as truth. Groups that once shouted prayers now sit in stillness. Knowing presence speaks louder than words. Mystics that once promised storms now confess. Silence is prophecy fulfilled. Rulers who once boasted have grown cautious, measuring every word, knowing silence waits to erase them. The eternal verdict has been delivered. Noise dies, silence rules, and your silence crowned you without ceremony. You did not clash for it. You did not beg for it. You simply arrived, and history bent. Empires expected riots, expected chaos, expected noise to match their noise. Instead, they faced quiet so heavy it erased their strategies, froze their halls, dismantled their confidence, and crowned itself above their thrones. That verdict cannot be overturned, so the record stands for all eternity. Noise is temporary, but silence is final. Empires rose on noise, and they collapsed in quiet. Councils shouted decrees, and they dissolved into stillness. Rulers shouted laws, and their words dissolved into dust. Only silence remained, echoing louder than history itself. And that silence carries your name,